Thank you.
Welcome back, Mr. McAllister. I've got a couple of questions that are by way of follow-up from our last session, and I just wonder if you're able to. I put a bunch of questions to you about electrical conductivity spikes in the Galungal Creek area. Yep. We were drawing a distinction between what happens on the western side of the project area with the Magilla. Could you maybe just, at the outset, draw a distinction for us between the company's obligations and the legislative requirements that govern pollution going into the Magilla, and draw that distinction for us between how you handle pollution going into Galungal on the western side?
Sure. The statutory compliance point is at a place called 009 in Magilla. That is downstream of the mine site. All our limits for downstream are set based on 009. Galungal Creek is to the west of the mine site, or it runs through the western side of the project area. That enters Magilla Creek downstream of 009. So to date, we are yet to set statutory limits for Galungal Creek, but we've been assuming the same statutory limits that apply in Magilla apply to Galungal, which is a conservative notion in that sense. Okay.
You've been, when you say assuming, but actually you do have statutory obligations over the Magilla which don't apply to Galungal. Is that?
Well, the statutory obligations in Magilla are based on protection of the downstream environment. So the fact that Galungal comes into Magilla, whether it's downstream of 009, we still assume the same environmental protection is in place.
Okay. When we spoke before, you were a bit unsure, or you basically, I think, pointed out that researchers had been unable to establish whether or what the source was of those spikes, whether it was subsurface or surface water. Has there been any work done? I think the last time we had this conversation was probably February. You're able to shed any further light on the source of the pollution?
In terms of the source, we're yet to determine its origins. We have certainly undertaken a fair bit of research into the issue to the west of the tailings dam wall. Now, the mining company as well have instituted Tammy Weaver. I think she undertook the independent investigation into the tailings dam a few years ago.
Yeah.
Now, she's been engaged by the mining company to undertake work to determine not only the flow paths of the potential source of contamination, but potentially the source itself. At the moment, it's originating from the western side of the tailings dam, and whether it's coming from the rock wall itself or whether it's some sign of leachate from the tailings dam is yet to be determined.
Okay. Yeah. Those are really your only two contamination pathways, aren't they? It's either runoff coming off the tailings dam wall, or it's coming out of the bottom of the dam.
Or subsurface. Well, there's three pathways in that. You can have surface water that enters the shallow groundwater.
Yeah.
You can have effectively shallow groundwater from the tailings dam wall itself that engages directly with the shallow groundwater table to the west of the dam.
Yeah.
Or potentially, if there's any seepage coming from the dam itself underneath the clay core, then that will be another source. All right. At the moment, I think the last discussions we had with the mining company indicated that the early research that Tammy Weaver had undertaken indicated that the contaminant origins were essentially travelling through the shallow groundwater aquifer only. So there doesn't seem to be any deeper groundwater occurrence at this point in time.
Thank you. Is it your understanding that on rehabilitation of the mine site, the entire dam structure would be removed?
The plans at the moment on rehabilitation are for all tailings to be put back in the pits and for that dam wall itself to be essentially flattened out to form part of the final landform. Okay,
so it's considered to be a temporary structure?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You estimate that research about the contamination pathways would be concluded before the company's going to be obliged to pull it down and put it all into the pit?
I believe the research into that particular issue will be completed by early third quarter this year.
All right, great. Yep. So you said the company had engaged her as a consultant. Yes. So is she working with OSS or with ERIS?
She's working directly with the mining company at the moment.
Okay. Do you have any visibility of?
We do, yes, through the Mine Site Technical Committee. In fact, we certainly engaged on that. We had a meeting last Friday, and that was one of the major topics of conversation. So we'll certainly be engaging with Tammy and the mining company ongoing.
All right. How would you describe the trend, again, in those electrical conductivity spikes? And maybe for the layperson, do you want to just explain for us why why you're monitoring for that? What does that signify?
Okay, in terms of why we're monitoring for it, I can possibly pass to Rick again, but I'll kick off. Electric conductivity is a surrogate for magnesium sulphate in Galungal and Magilla. Because we can't actively monitor for magnesium sulphate in a continuous fashion, our research indicates the two are quite a good match in terms of a surrogate, so we can directly monitor environmental conductivity, and that will give us a magnesium value on a continuous basis. And magnesium itself is the potential toxicant that we're dealing with in terms of protection of the environment.
Okay, and that would be coming out in the leachate or in the water that's
magnesium.
However it's getting out.
Magnesium sulphate is one of the predominant contaminants that originate from the rock that comes out of Ranger pits. So that would be both in any stockpiles that are formed, both that and the construction material used for the tailings dam, because essentially that's the same as the stockpiles, the waste stockpiles, and also it would exist in tailings.
At what point do these spikes lead to the conclusion that contamination is affecting Kakadu National Park? Because at that point, the company, there's some legal obligations for remediation would apply.
The spikes that we're seeing in Galungal Creek are elevated and have, over this past wet season, exceeded some of our guidelines for ecotoxicological guidelines for magnesium sulphate. Those, as I said, are based on work done for Magilla Creek. When we noticed that these spikes were exceeding those values, we instituted essentially continuous ecotox monitoring in the creek to provide the assurance. And to date, that ecotox monitoring hasn't indicated that there's been any impact.
So you're monitoring, because the creek kind of ducks in and out of the project area boundaries a couple of times. So your monitoring points, are they permanent or are they staff going out and collecting water?
The monitoring points have continuous monitoring
so it's a device in the creek.
They also trigger automated sampling that are linked to the continuous monitoring devices. So based on environmental conductivity, for instance, we have triggers for sampling to occur once it exceeds a certain point. So samples are taken essentially effectively during those spikes. On the back of the continuous monitoring gear, we have some in situ ecotoxicological tests underway, and they're the ones that I was talking about that have been ongoing permanently.
Okay. Do you publish those directly to your website?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, once the analysis has been done. And is there a correlation with a heavy downpour or a heavy wet season? Is it a direct correlation, or is it not that simple?
Look, you could possibly say there is a direct correlation depending on where the thunderstorms occur at that time of the season. This season particularly, wet season, has been particularly dry, so we haven't seen the significant wetting up you get with a decent monsoon. So a lot of the flow in the creeks has been very sporadic and has been dependent heavily on isolated thunderstorm events. And if you get one of those over the catchment area of the tailings dam, for instance, that will lead to a different signal going into the creek than, for instance, if it had occurred over the whole catchment area.
It's way up the basin.
Yep.
Okay, that's understood. And so when you do get direct downpours onto those tailing structures, do you then see concurrent spikes in electrical conductivity?
Would you say
we
yes?
may.
Yeah.
That won't be the only factor driving those spikes, but certainly you may see spikes occurring under those circumstances.
Okay. So what was your threshold for deciding whether contamination is affecting Kakadu National Park? Because it sounds to me like you've kind of got the warning lights on the dashboard. At what point do they breach their statutory obligations, that there be no off-site impacts?
In terms of impacting the environment, I'll get Rick to talk about the ecotox results, but in terms of statutory obligations, as I said, the limits for 009 we're applying upstream in Galungal, and as I said, they're conservative. We're currently in the process of setting, or going through the research of setting parameters for Galungal Creek itself in a statutory sense. Outside of that, in terms of statutory obligations, that's a matter for the Department of Mines and Energy Northern Territory. But I would assume that they would base it on environmental harm being detected over and above whether they've breached the specific limit in Magilla. So you'd want to see that there was material environmental harm occurring.
And how do they test for that? What does that look
Well,
like?
that would return to our research in terms of the ecotox studies.
Yeah, effectively due to the using the biological monitoring. So the chemical monitoring of the spikes is effectively our first line of evidence or our first line of defence. That in itself doesn't tell us that the environment is being harmed, it just tells us that it's exceeding a level whereby there might be impacts, and that's effectively where our biological monitoring kicks in. And that's multifaceted as well. We have the in-stream ongoing snail toxicity monitoring.
Snails?
Snails, yes. That tells us whether or not we're seeing any subtle effects at that point in time. It's kind of like an early warning signal. And then at the end of every wet season, we undertake the more comprehensive biological monitoring programs, looking at macroinvertebrates and fish communities.
Okay.
That sampling has only recently been completed and is then usually analysed over the next couple of months.
And that provides you, you're doing that annually, so that provides you with a reasonably good snapshot at the end of each wet season of what changes have occurred.
It's effectively an integrator of what, if any, impacts might have occurred across as a result of the entire wet season.
When are you proposing to have this year's results?
Typically, the majority of those results are published in the annual report, so that would be probably third quarter of this year.
Yeah, okay. So you wouldn't consider that the company is yet in breach of its environmental requirements?
Not at this point in time, no.
Okay, what occurs if they are found to be in breach?
Firstly, the Northern Territory Government, Department of Mines and Energy, would be, as the day-to-day regulator, would be, as I said, seeking to determine if there had been any material environmental harm, and they would take a course of action in relation to their Act, Mine Management Act. In terms of the Commonwealth's obligations, the environmental requirements that sit on the Ranger Project Area Authorisation and on the export permits are a matter for the Department of Industry and Science. So I guess they would be referring to us in terms of our research to determine whether or not we believe there had been an impact, and at that point in time I presume they would take their course of action further if they wanted to.
All right. But that's not really your role, is it?
No.
You are there to monitor and inform.
We're there to provide, yes, the monitoring and the public assurance, and to undertake the research to determine whether there have been impacts.
Okay. Are you still part of the investigating task force that was charged with responsibility for determining the cause and therefore any action arising out of the leach tank spill of December 2013?
We were part of the task force. That task force hasn't met for probably 3/4 of a year, I would say.
Is that because it's wound up its work?
Pretty well. We've completed our report, as we've reported previously. Department of Mines and Energy have apparently completed a report. We're yet to see that report. We've asked for it a number of times. The Department of Industry and Science engaged the independent...
That's the Northern Territory
Yep.
Department of Mines and Energy.
Yeah. Just spell that out for us. You're aware that they've concluded a report, but they're not handing it over to you?
To date, they have not provided us with their report into their own report into the incident.
And what's your understanding of when that was concluded?
We haven't been given an exact date. I presume it's either with their ministers or with their lawyers.
Okay.
It's a matter for them to pursue if they wish to pursue whether there's been a breach of the authorisations.
When did you first request a copy?
We would have requested a copy probably Q3 last year.
Of what, sorry?
Q3, probably.
And when was the last time that the NT Department of Mines sought advice from you guys over that incident?
In relation to what aspects?
Any aspect at all?
The incident itself is an ongoing point of discussion at mine site tenure committees. The other report that was instigated by the Department of Industry and Science, the independent report, which Noetic undertook, produced a series of recommendations that we continue to track within the Mine Site Tenure Committee. A lot of those revolve around the institution of what's called process safety on site. That process safety culture change at Ranger is well underway, and the mining company and the Department of Mines and Energy and Department of Industry report back on that routinely at the Mine Site Tenure Committee. So in that sense, we discuss the matter on a semi-regular basis.
Okay, so the third quarter of last year, so conceivably 6 months ago you requested that document, and
Yes.
it's still not forthcoming.
Not to this point in time.
So are there any developments that you're aware of regarding referrals for legal action or any other relevant considerations arising from the incident, or is that all out of your hands?
That's all out of my hands.
It
I'm
is.
not aware of any.
Okay. All right, I'll leave that there. Thanks. I might come back if there's time later. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay.